Hello and welcome to Gradiant's podcast. We have our Procurement Manager, Subbulakshmi, with us today. Subbu has over 11 years of experience in engineering and procurement. But before Gradient, she was the procurement lead at Ecolab, where she handled the equipment category for the Asia-Pacific region. Subbu joined Gradient right before the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic, bringing many supply chains to a halt, creating bottlenecks, redundancy, and mass disruption of resources for companies and regions across the globe. Subbu has been instrumental in working with Gradient's vendors to maintain a consistent supply chain so that our customers continue to receive the highest standards in water treatment. Her creativity and diligence while working with vendors has been paramount during this unprecedented time. Hi, Subbu, and welcome.
Hi, Meg. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here with us, and I expect our listeners are excited to learn more about the role of Gradient and Gradient's procurement process and strategies. So firstly, how did you get into procurement and some of your background?
I started off my career as a project engineer. While I was in the role with my previous organization, the procurement department conducted an audit on the engineering department to try and understand why this portion of the spend was not flowing through procurement, among a few other discussion pointers. And what was repeatedly highlighted as a pain point during this discussion was that people on the other side of the bench, and by that I mean procurement, often do not understand the nature of project procurement and the challenges it brings with it. It's very, very different from procurement of raw materials or indirects and services. If you talk ideal scenario, that would be to give procurement an opportunity to invite multiple suppliers to the bidding process, have sufficient time to hold commercial discussions and then make the best pick. But reality is far from that. There are so many back and forths between the customer, sales, and the supplier. To repeat the same process with multiple new suppliers is painstaking and sometimes just not possible. So many times the supplier is also already introduced to the customer during technical clarifications, which then eliminates the possibility of switching them out. And frankly, you're also never going to have a lot of time for negotiations. So within these boundaries, procurement has to do the best. So the engineering department basically felt the insiders did a better job with it, and so they preferred to handle their spend on their own. I was one of the engineers who was involved in procurement back then. I was offered an opportunity to move to procurement and do what I was already doing, but trained right. Took it up, 8 years on, here I am.
Wow, excellent. And what exactly do you do at Gradient, and what does that role entail here?
In a nutshell, I oversee all the supply chain activities for this region. When I started off at Gradient about a year and a half ago, I was actually given a blank canvas to work with, which in fact was the most exciting part. My initial months were spent setting up a structure, putting the right processes in place, and having everything documented. Slowly and steadily, I began establishing a preferred supplier base for procurement and logistics, solidifying our terms and conditions with these suppliers. We're still in the process of identifying and vetting suppliers, and this is going to take some time. We're also identifying which suppliers is for the long haul and is worth investing our time and efforts into. But with every project, we learn what works for us and what doesn't. So continuous refinement of how we work, who we work with, assessing and mitigating the risks that comes with these choices. And, adapting to changing dynamics is a very big piece of what I would do day to day.
Yes, and with that in mind, we all know that we had a COVID-19, which has completely changed the landscape, specifically with supply chains. And from facing the multiple breaks at the distribution level, the manufacturing level, and to the customer, it's been quite difficult, if not impossible. And yet you've succeeded at keeping a very consistent flow from our vendors to our customers. Could you tell us how you managed to do this and what strategies you employed?
Sure. Let's talk procurement first. Due to the pandemic, raw material and labor costs have shot up drastically. Lead times have doubled. So we've had to bank on our relationship with suppliers, to keep these impacts to a minimum. Cost versus risk had to be evaluated for practically every buy. We took some calculated decisions, with lesser risk components, fabrication, and paid more for the high risk category. This kept things on a balance. Sourcing close to home has been the mantra to keep risks to a minimum. However, there were several orders that were placed prior to the onset of COVID, which obviously could not be revoked. So we've had to get creative in managing these outstation suppliers. Video conferencing, regular Zoom team calls to work through the technical and commercial clarifications. The other challenges were, how do you monitor the fabrication progress? How do you witness the FAT tests? So we've had to take the assistance of local expediting and inspection service agencies to see us through the fabrication and testing phases in the different locations. This way, we are confident of our suppliers' progress and could in turn assure our customers of the same. Again, coming to the topic of logistics, it's been completely unpredictable, both again from cost and lead time standpoint. And unfortunately, the logistics scene has been shifting on a daily basis. So planning in advance has been key. We've taken deliveries in advance for overseas shipments. We've clubbed orders across multiple projects or items for the same project, but required at different timelines, just to avoid any unforeseen delays.
Well, that's really great, especially with all the bottlenecks going on, I know. Yeah, definitely. What is your philosophy when selecting vendors, and what are the moral implications behind your work?
The first instinct, I would say, is always to reach out to suppliers, who you've worked with previously. You have vetted them. There's a great deal of trust and comfort. And so it's an easy bet, also an obvious bet. We also have some brilliant minds and experienced folks at Gradiant, and it would be a big loss if I don't tap into that pool for supplier feedbacks. So that typically is my next stop. But while I say this, it's extremely crucial to maintain a balance between existing and known suppliers and new suppliers, because that's the only way you're going to be able to guarantee you have the best deal every single time. When we talk about supplier qualification criteria, my number one, given the nature of this industry, would be quality, consistency, and reliability. They all kind of go hand in hand. I want my suppliers to provide the same level of product and service quality every single time we buy, irrespective of the variable factors. Because if one component supplier compromises in the quality, it affects the performance of our entire system, and we can't deliver what we promised. So it has a boomerang effect. I'm not a procurement professional if I don't talk about costs. So total cost of ownership would be a close second. This is actually the most spoken, yet also the most ignored aspect by folks. What do you mean by total cost of ownership? So let's take the example of an instrument, say a conductivity transmitter. You have the transmitter, the sensor, and the cable. Most suppliers would give you a quote for that. Now, let's say the product's standard warranty is 12 months, while your contract with the customer states that you would provide 24 months warranty for the entire system and all the components that go with it. So now you have to buffer in additional charges for 12 months warranty. Let's say you've also committed to providing test certificates for all the instruments. So that's additional. Perhaps your team needs support during installation and commissioning of this transmitter. So you now need to discuss manpower charges for that. A look at the Incoterms shows the price is Xworks warehouse, and the warehouse is actually located in Spain. So you have to factor in logistics charges for these. If you're buying spares, then that's additional. So clearly the dollars can add up pretty quickly if you see. Supplier A may have the lowest component cost, but everything else may be an add-on at a premium price. Supplier B, on the other hand, may be charging a premium on the component, but he is willing to offer you all the other services at zero to minimal cost. So looking at the picture in totality will help you choose the right fit for a particular scenario. So if the next time all you need is the component and no frills, then your supplier preference will likely be very different. Number 3, criteria-wise for me, would be risks and references. When you're choosing a supplier for a very critical piece of equipment, or you are choosing a fabricator who's going to handle the entire construction piece, a simple comparative tabulation on cost, spec, quality, and lead time is not going to work. There are so many moving pieces, unforeseen changes that you're likely to see throughout the duration of the project. So you need a highly skilled, a very accommodating supplier. They should be able to preempt possible issues and address them proactively. So it's akin to looking at a partner. So how do we get it right? References are extremely reassuring. The scale of projects they've handled in the past, the timeline of these projects, customers' satisfaction working with them, this gives you a pretty good idea about their execution capabilities. I personally also place a great deal of emphasis on how I and the team, walk out of interactions with the suppliers. Will the team be comfortable working with them for months together? Do we trust their claims? Have they captured our requirements correctly? And is that translating in the offer that they're submitting? Does the supplier seem comfortable with Gradiant team? These are valuable intangibles. And lastly, I would say would be the lead time. Most suppliers offer pretty similar lead times for a particular category. So for a standard project with standard lead times buffered, this will not be a pain point. But if you have an expedited project, then suddenly the number one talking point is the lead time. So the entire order I just listed is pretty much subject to change on a case-by-case basis. And to answer your second question, what are the moral implications in this field?
Yes.
What do we mean typically when we say ethics in procurement? Doing what's right for the company, what it stands for, and what's right for the society in which the company operates.
Yep.
You want to comply by all legal, moral, and societal obligations and expectations. But the challenge is that these are very contextual. So how do we work around it? Internally, we're working around defining the ethics and code of conduct clearly as an organization and as a department so that there is no ambiguity. Knowing your team, being aware of their interactions with suppliers and their rationale for choosing suppliers. Having a clearly documented supplier qualification process and making sure your team actually uses it. Re-auditing your suppliers every 2 to 4 years and simply just allowing an open communication channel for the team to highlight any potential red flags or simply to clarify if something is right or not without the fear of any repercussions or judgment is actually a powerful, powerful tool. And externally, what we're planning to do is to notify suppliers and Gradient's supplier code of conduct policies and guidelines and send regular refreshers about the same. We're also planning to work with suppliers who could potentially be long-term partners to identify areas that need improvement.
Very well said. And on that note, how do you build the relationships with the key suppliers?
It's actually almost exactly the same as marriage, I would say, trust and communication. Open and regular communication, I must add, and simply the willingness to invest the required time and effort. At Gradient, like any other organization, we have so many different teams, dealing in so many different buckets, and they each have different expectations and support level requirements from suppliers. Let's say if you take R&D, for instance, they work on research and optimization, and so the need for innovators and collaborators in suppliers. Proposals, on the contrary, favor suppliers who have a quick turnaround time. Engineering is all about the spec requirements, and they need a supplier who will cooperate through the multiple back and forths. Operations needs the best after-sales support, and we supply chain, we're all about the best price and the best lead time at all times. So it's my job to ensure that all our suppliers understand these various requirements clearly, thereby, empowering them to support us the right way. When you keep the suppliers invested, through this entire chain, it helps build a certain level of trust and comfort. Healthy competition and a diversified supplier base will always be key. But what's equally important is that we respect and reward suppliers who've stayed the course with us and supported us ably. Because at the end of the day, both the supplier and the customer, we enter into a relationship with the hopes of having, our needs and expectations met. But what we've always got to remember is that we're dealing with human relationships and it's not a digital one. So both parties may be faced with unforeseen circumstances or sudden limitations or concerns. Just address them together as a team. Because you're the customer and they're the supplier, you don't have to be on the opposite sides of the fence.
And do you try to source your suppliers locally? And what are the challenges of executing projects globally?
At Gradient, we're trying to strike the optimum balance between a local and a global supplier base, but it's often easier said than done. Because some of the technology that we use is not necessarily available locally in all the markets. Some of our preferred vendors and brands do not have a local presence. These are obviously challenges and not an ideal case scenario. But as a team, we will continue to focus on adapting our technology so as to open up the supplier base and have more open discussions with suppliers who are willing to act as partners and collaborators.
Mhm. And lastly, outside of the pandemic, what other challenges do you see the world supply chain face in the future from a moral, environmental, or even a limited resource perspective?
Today and tomorrow's supply chain is actually going to be constantly subjected to new changes and new requirements, be it political developments or natural disasters, pandemics and epidemics like, COVID-19, a shift in consumer requirements, increasing emphasis on green supply chains. So agility and adaptability will be key because the one who adapts the fastest to a crisis emerges victorious because he's already converted it to an opportunity and it's no longer a crisis. Post the pandemic, in fact, even now, as we are, working our way through the pandemic, the battle between regionalization versus globalization, single source versus a diversified supplier base, automation versus manual steering, the concept of just-in-time replenishment and lean inventories is going to be very intense.
Yeah.
But there is no one-size-fits-all solution for all the organizations. And that's very important to understand. It's important to identify your organization's vulnerabilities and then reconfigure and redeploy as necessary. Sustainability has been a pretty big focus for supply chain in the last decade or so. A lot of MNCs adhere to certain social and environmental standards, and they also pledge to work with suppliers that do the same. But realizing this in practice is extremely hard, as exposed by several big controversies in the recent past surrounding some very big names. So going forward, there will certainly be a lot of emphasis in managing sustainability, which will include going back to the ground all the way and, peeling back some of the expectations and restrictions we as customers impose on our supplier base. Because if you look close enough, that's where all the problem starts. I also think organizations need to celebrate success stories beyond cost savings when it comes to, procurement. Hitting social and environmental goals should also be equally celebrated and incentivized because that's the only way you're going to set this whole process right.
Definitely. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Subbu. The Gradient would not be where it is today without your creativity and your temperament during this extraordinary time. So we really appreciate all that you've done.
Thank you, Meg. It's been a fantastic journey with Gradiant, and I can't wait to see what the future holds for us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for listening to Gradient's podcast.